You are in for a treat. Next up, we have Isadora is going to talk to you about why we all need sexual healing, jumping off from Dr. Perlmutter this morning. So let's give Sam a warm welcome.
Well, hello. Is anyone here excited to hear about sexual healing? I'm a sex expert, and I believe that every single one of you needs a sexual healing. And I'll get into that more in a little bit. But today, I'm not going to be giving you tips on, how to have multiple orgasms or how to have sex for 9 hours like Sting. Today, I'm actually going to be much more vulnerable. And I'm going to share a story with you of my own sexual healing. And this is a story that almost killed me because I spent so many years in shame and isolation around this. And it's actually something so common that I wish that instead of isolating, we could join together and find compassion and shared humanity around our sexuality. I became a sex expert because I came from a very sexually disempowered place. I actually grew up on a Christian cult. So I would wake up in the mornings and I would walk up a hill before the sun came up to go milk the goats that were part of our communal farm. But to do that, I would get dressed in a bonnet and a long dress that covered me from my neck, that covered my arms all the way to my wrist, and that covered me all the way down to my ankles, so that none of my skin would be showing. Now I wear what the hell I want. I mean, who wants to hide this? But I was taught, and the reason I dressed that way then was that it was a woman's responsibility to cover her body, or she would make men sin. I remember my mom saying to me, men are dogs. They can't control their sexuality. So if you look at them the wrong way, or dress a certain way, and something bad happens, it will be your fault. Not only will it be your fault that something happened to you, it will be your fault that you made that man sin. So obviously, I don't believe that anymore. But at the time, I was being told to cover my body because that was a woman's responsibility, but I wasn't a woman. I was a child. I was a 5-year-old girl. I was, taught many other things growing up on a cult, and some of them were very beautiful. I loved certain things about growing up in a cult or a commune. It felt like one big family, and every Sunday we'd get together and we'd have sing-alongs. And I love that feeling of devotion and connection to prayer and God and something bigger than ourselves. And all the other girls on this commune felt like my sisters. And it was so beautiful to have that sense of a family and that kind of idealism. I grew up in a log cabin, and we didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity. Some of my earliest memories was my mom taking care of our family by having an old-fashioned axe and chopping firewood on a stump so that she could put it in a wood-burning stove and feed our family for dinner. And both my parents had actually grown up in the city, but this was at the time of the Vietnam War, and there were a lot of people who were tired of mainstream culture and formed these communes and these cults with very good intentions. But unfortunately, that fairy tale, for me, became much less than a fairy tale. I was also taught that if I went to a movie that wasn't G-rated, devils would attach themselves to my body. And when I walked out, my angels couldn't protect me anymore. I was also taught that speaking in tongues meant Jesus could save me. And I was taught at 5 years old, I remember having a preschool teacher saying, "You are all sinners, and you will all go to hell unless Jesus saves you." And that fear lived in my body. I was also taught that a good girl should be seen and not heard. I was taught Father knows best. And more than anything, never, ever question your parents. I remember looking up, and on the wall, hanging in our home, was a wooden paddle, and engraved on it was a scripture verse. And it said, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Now, I was so young I didn't understand a lot of the things that were happening, especially the shaming around my body as a female or the shame around sexuality. But it set the stage for me to be ashamed of my body and to be afraid of my sexual power. And then one day, my whole life changed. I was sexually abused. And not once, but for many years. And I look back now, and I wish I could help that little girl. I wish I could help her to ask for help sooner. But I also know the way I was raised set the stage for me to feel it was my fault. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. And I felt it was my fault. And my abuser was my father. So I was also protecting my abuser. And my mother told me, if you tell anyone what's happening, you won't have any friends. No one's parents will let you spend time with them because you'll be a threat to them. And if you tell anyone what's happening, your father will go to jail, where they'll probably murder him, because in society, pedophiles are probably the most hated population. And she said, once he goes to jail, they'll put you and your brothers in foster care. And no matter how bad you think this is, that will be worse. At least we're your parents, and we love you. So I had nowhere to turn for help. And I think the most damaging thing about trauma is that isolation, and that you begin to think that you're so broken, that you have such a fatal flaw, that if people knew the truth, no one would ever really love you. And I had no one to appeal to, no one to talk to. And I remember that silence, even what my mother had said, that was an agreement. If you tell the truth to anyone, we won't take care of you anymore. We won't love you anymore. And that triggers very deep survival mechanisms around sex is now mixed with survival. Trauma and seeking help is now pitted against survival. So I did the only thing I knew how to do at the time. I talked to God, because I was raised Christian. Psalm is actually my real name. And ironically, Psalm means song of praise to God. And I remember getting on my hands and knees one night before I went to bed. And it was my last resort, because there was no one human that I could talk to. And I said, God, would you please take some time from your busy schedule and look at me and look at what's happening here. Because the God that I've been told to believe in would never let this kind of suffering happen. I said, God, just wave a magic wand. Make my dad a good man again. I don't want him to be a bad man. I don't want him to go to jail. I just want it all to stop. I want it to disappear. And at that time, I really thought maybe God just hadn't paid attention yet to what was happening. And I woke up in the morning, and I was living in the same nightmare. And something snapped in me. And I lost faith. I lost faith in God, because any God I could believe in wouldn't allow this kind of pain to exist in this world. Not for me, not for any other woman, not for any other man. I lost faith in my parents because I knew they would never stop the cycle of violence and abuse. And after I lost faith, I really just stopped giving a fuck about anything. But I still never asked for help. And like so many teenagers who've had abuse, instead of asking for help, I started being rebellious and acting out and getting in trouble. And I remember my school counselor calling in my mom, and we sat there, and my school counselor said, Sam's so smart. Why is she acting out? And my mom said, I have no idea. We haven't raised her to be like that. And I sat there in silence, because breaking the code, the agreement of silence for my abuser, was not something that was optional. It was so deeply ingrained in me, I didn't even know how to question it anymore. And after that, I remember I started to develop physically. At 16, I got big tits. Tits are powerful. They feed babies. They give pleasure. But I remember having been raised to be so ashamed about sexuality, but already knowing there was so much hypocrisy. I started carrying clothes and hiding them in my locker and wearing tight, sexy outfits at school, and then going home. And I'd sneak out at night and get drunk. And I had my first sexual encounters making out. And I got caught one night. And my mom said, we didn't raise you to be like this. That's wrong. Sex is for marriage. You're being a whore. And I said, with all I was able to muster at that time, still not being able to speak the truth, but I said, I'm not happy. Look at me. You're my mother. I need therapy. I need help. And she said, Psalm, you're such a beautiful girl. You have no reason to be unhappy. You're ungrateful. And at that moment, I knew that she would never be able to admit to herself what was happening, and that she would always blame me for the sins of my father and any sins of sexuality. And something broke in me, and all that repressed anger of trying to be a good girl and it never mattering and all the hypocrisy finally snapped. And at 17 years old, I packed everything I could in one backpack, and before the sun came up, I ran away. And I remember running away to get on a bus to take me anywhere away from home, anywhere away from my abusers. And I remember thinking, you're throwing your life away. I'm dropping out of high school. I'm going to be a homeless teenage runaway. I'm a 17-year-old girl alone in the streets. And I didn't care. I said, I may live or I may die, but I'm not going to live this lie. I'm not going to live the hypocrisy around sexuality and shame. And then I spent my 20s in a hot mess of sex and drugs. I moved to Hollywood, and I used anything I could to escape my pain, but I still kept the secret. I still protected my abuser. I was still afraid of being judged. I was afraid if I told people, no one could really love me. I was too broken and wounded. And I remember it would feel like the red hots, like I couldn't crawl out of my own skin, and the only escape would be maybe drinking, because then I was numb, and then I felt free. Or doing drugs, and then I would feel free. Or sex. I had sex with men. I had sex with women. It was Hollywood. It was an exciting time. I'm not mad at it, except it wasn't empowered. But even in those moments where I would have sex was like my heroin. Some people who've had sexual abuse become hyposexual and they shut down their sexuality. I was hypersexual. Sex was somewhere I could go and escape myself. The French call the orgasm le petit mort, the little death. It means for 1 second in time, my ego dies, time disappears, I forget my name. And I remember, even though at the time they weren't empowered choices, and because I had a sex wound and that hidden guilt and shame, I would have sex, beat myself up about it, and go have disempowered sex again to relieve the pain of beating myself up. That guilt-shame spiral of reenacting. But even then, when I would have sex, I remember feeling like, this is so amazing. This is transcendent. There's something magic here. I would have sex and feel like white light was everywhere. And I felt like I connected with something eternal, with my spirit, with my soul, through that sexual ecstasy. It was sublime. And I knew that I shouldn't feel ashamed about it. But I did feel ashamed because of my sex wound that I hadn't learned to heal. And I felt ashamed because, honestly, in this world, no one knows how to talk about sex. Even people who think they're really open-minded. And I eventually bottomed out in a suicidal episode in an emergency room where I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, taking lithium, and I was so tired from the lithium. I gained 30 pounds. I couldn't get out of bed. I felt nothing. I was numb. So then the only thing I knew how to do to take control of that situation was do drugs that I've done before. So I said, okay, if the doctors have me on lithium, I'm going to go take amphetamines. It's like a cup of coffee, right? Because we're dealing in extremes now. So I end up in the emergency room in a heady mixture of lithium and amphetamines. And I'm all alone in the emergency room, shivering. You know those little hospital gowns. You feel like you're naked and they barely even cover your ass crack. And I'm in there alone, shaking, scared. And I start going through my thought process. I'm like, where are my parents? Somebody should come save me right now. Everybody else's parents at least would come and help them, and I don't even have that. I'm so broken. I'm so screwed. I'm more screwed than anyone else in this world. And some other voice finally woke up in me, and it was like, Psalm, that's why you're here. You're here because the 5-year-old little girl screaming inside you, still screaming in silence, acting out with self-destructive behaviors, with addiction and sex and drugs. She wants somebody to save her. But nobody's going to show up. And that voice said, Psalm, this is your last chance. And if you don't get it together, you're going to be dead. And up until that moment in my life, I think I wanted to be dead because life had been too hard. And my struggle had crushed my spirit. But at that moment, I woke up and I said, I want to live. And I know I came for a powerful reason. And I said, God, if you get me out of this hospital room, a little bit different. I said, God, if you get me out of this emergency room, I will spend the rest of my life helping other people like me heal from the shame and have sexual healing. And the first step to doing that, after I left that emergency room and had my wake-up rock bottom moment, the first step to get out of rock bottom and being tired of my own bullshit and being tired of playing the victim and deciding only I could save myself, that first step was getting off the medication and replacing it with yoga. So I found yoga classes, and yoga gave me this bridge to finally be like, wow, I don't have to be ashamed of my body. I don't have to numb myself for my body. Until that point, I would numb my body until I'd get drunk, act out, TGIF, and regret it later. Repeat next Friday. And in that moment, when I started doing yoga, I would inhale and exhale and be like, oh my God, there's enough positive energy for me to handle my obstacles. And my spirit is greater than these challenges and traumas. But even with yoga, I knew something was missing because I would go to meditation classes and yoga teachers, and I was like, I need sexual healing. And everybody would be like, oh, well, we don't really talk about that here. I went to a Zen retreat, very beautiful, very peaceful. It helped me to calm my mind, but all the monks are there with shaved heads. I'm like, so the goal is to look like a baby or an old man? Like, if I win in your meditation system, I'm a dude who doesn't have sex. So, okay, that's enlightenment. No thanks. And I was like, there has to be somewhere that all this juiciness is for something good. Take me to where they appreciate that God made me juicy. Where the hell is that? And then I found Tantra. And that same little voice that talked to me in the hospital said, this is it. This is the sexual healing you need, and this is sexual healing the whole world needs. And that little voice said, you have to go to India. You have to go all in. You have to go learn this for yourself and to share with the world. And I was terrified because I had to leave all my security blankets behind. I had to move out of my apartment, sleep in my car a few nights, stay in a friend's garage while I saved up my money to go to India. But I trusted that little voice of intuition, and when I got to India, I met my guru. And he was in the south of India, not famous, didn't travel to America. Nobody knew who he was, but he had the secret to unlock my power. And he taught me that there was a lineage of Tantra over 5,000 years old of sacred sexuality, and that there was actually a time in human history. This isn't woo. There was a time in human history that the oldest images of God or goddess are a female with breast and a vagina, just like mine. And instead of thinking, like I was raised, that God was like a grumpy old man, looking down every time I had sex. He's like, oh, you just lost points. You lost heaven points. She had sex again. I hate it when people have sex. If you just kind of bottle that up and be a monk or a nun, then you win. I was like, who invented that god? Some man. Yeah, low key, they took our power. So there was a point in time of that human history where we stopped revering that naked body, where we stopped revering that goddess image of a naked woman with breast and a vagina, right? And actually demonized it, right? The story of the Garden of Eden is all the story about a naked woman made all the problems that we all live with now. Don't trust desire. Don't trust a naked woman. But he taught me how to reclaim that path of sacred sexuality, which, again, it's not woo. All human beings have a sexual, erotic nature, but we're at war within ourselves. How do we own our sexual, erotic nature without sticking it into the shadow and then acting out bad behaviors, poor behaviors, or suffering that's not necessary? And I found the answer. It was that Tantra. And I remember going into the temple at my guru's ashram, and literally this temple has a statue of a naked woman, just like me, and people would come and pray and touch this image. And in that moment, right, they were honoring the thing I had been taught to be ashamed of. And I had a deja vu moment, and I said, I remember I've been here before. I finally have found my tribe, and it all makes sense. It makes sense to me why I had to live through the suffering and sexual abuse, and it makes sense that that pain that could have crushed me has become my purpose to share with the world. And my guru taught me tools like the tantric breast massage. And I went to my room in the ashram, and I gave myself a tantric breast massage. And it was this aha moment that pleasure was actually a path to happiness, and that stimulating this orgasmic pleasure at my breasts, where I've been taught to have body shame, released something called oxytocin, the love and bonding hormone. And that if we had a more natural way of experiencing our sexuality and erotic nature, that we would actually live happier lives. And I challenge each of you sitting here for a moment to just question, is there some area in your life that you have a little shame around sexuality? Because I believe shame is the number one thing holding back human evolution. And this disconnect between our natural primal sexual beings is the number one problem holding us back from evolving. So just for a minute, squirm in your seats. If I'm making you uncomfortable, I hope so. I'm here to rip that Band-Aid off, and I'm here to normalize the conversation around sexuality. It's long overdue. I believe that shame causes the most common roadblocks, like sexless marriage, people cheating and lying to each other and themselves, women who are unable to experience orgasm, porn addiction. One of my students right now is a 53-year-old woman, and she never had an orgasm until she turned 53 and studied with me. But she'd already had children. So she had laid her body down thousands of times and had sex thousands of times where she got screwed instead of enjoyed herself. And we got to the root of her shame and issue and block, which was that at 12 years old, a camp counselor had taken advantage of her, and all the other girls in her camp called her a slut. And that slut shaming, from that one moment in time, locked her for 40 years, that her own body was a source of shame. And at 53, she had a breakthrough. And she's like, Sam, I just self-pleasured and I had an orgasm. And I was like, good for you, baby. And mazel tov, many more for the rest of your life. Because that's your body, and you can own it. And actually, your body was built to experience this pleasure. It should be the most natural thing we ever talk about. And yet we've turned it into a shadow, and we've demonized it, and we're all suffering because of it. So I just want to thank you for being part of normalizing the conversation around sexuality today, and for being part of this sexual healing that is so necessary for each of us and the whole planet. This is the next sexual revolution. So thank you.